The recipe said to set the oven at 180 degrees, but I don't know how to use it now because it's facing the wall. What's going on, YouTube? We've just wrapped up our stream where we made a list of the best dungeon sets for you to own in the Elder Scrolls Online. This is, of course, dependent on the type of content that you play, and as discussed on stream, this also takes into account things such as you may not own all the DLC, so you're going to see quite a few different DPS PvE options that may depend on which of the DLC dungeon packs you own. But we're going to talk about all of that and more in today's video, and the list that you're about to see on screen will also be in the Discord and you'll be able to reference it. We may also continue to add notes to it as well, because right now it's just a list of content, set names, and then where they come from, but it will probably be also expanded upon in the future, and it can also be added by comments below. So feel free to throw a comment below. Tell me what sets you think are missing. Let's jump into it. And here is this list. Also, just want to note too that there are some sets that were listed in places such as solo for builds, but also probably could go into a couple other places as well. So just keep that in mind. But we're also going to break down each of these sets individually, but this is the actual list as it appears in its entirety. But let's start going through each individual area, starting with solo. And we start with the most popular solo set in the game currently, which is Sergeant's Mail. It drops from Wayrest Sewers 1 and 2, so it's literally perfect for your farming needs. It's a base game dungeon, and when you deal damage with a heavy attack, you gain a stack of Sergeant's Focus for 5 seconds, increasing the damage of your heavy attacks by 645 per stack. This can occur once every second and stacks up to 4 times. It's very straightforward. It's a very easy class to solo pilot because you just go around heavy attacking. Personally, I think this goes very well with the lightning because lightning is very hard to miss with and it will lock onto targets for you. And there's also other sets that pair well with it, but you can certainly weave this into other things as well, including flame builds and other solo type content builds. It's very easy to pilot. Let's keep it moving. Next up, we have Noble Duelist Silk. Now, this comes from the Blessed Crucible. Who's blessing that Crucible? Well, you have to farm the dungeon to find out. When you deal damage to the light or heavy attack in melee range, you increase the damage of your light and heavy attacks against monsters, importantly, by 2110 for 15 seconds, and this can occur every 12 seconds. This obviously is limited to PvE content because this might shock you. The players that you're killing in PvP, while they may seem like monsters, are not coded as monsters, unfortunately. So this is only going to be useful for PvE content, but it's very good for light and heavy attack builds, highly suggested by the community when we're doing our live streaming, and it can fit into any of the other types of solo builds that you'll see. You just want to make sure that you're activating its criteria, which is in melee range. So this is not as popular as the first set that we talked about, but it is one that you can still consider when you're looking at making a solo build. Next is another good fun solo set for us, and that is the Draw King Slayer set. This is also going to come from Fungal Grotto 1 and 2, which you will probably be farming a lot during the Undaunted Celebration event. So this one's fascinating because it gives you major brutality and sorcery at all times, which increases your weapon and spell damage by 20%, and when you kill an enemy, you get Major Expedition for 8 seconds. That's a movement speed buff of 30%. This is actually a really good solo soul, and you're getting a nice little speed up while you kill things in the overworld. A lot of people love solo content. They love to be able to have that nice mobility. They love the damage increase. They love the buff stacking that this pairs with the Oaken Soul Ring. And overall, even though it comes from one of the easiest places in the world, it's still a good set. Next up is Sunderflame. And I just want to note too that there are definitely sets that bleed into other areas of being good for content. This is definitely one of those. But because this came up, we were talking about heavy attack builds, I put it in kind of the solo portion of this video, but you could certainly weave this into PvP builds, PvE builds, etc., etc. But this is Sunderflame. It comes from City of Ash 1 and 2, a very farmed place. And basically, when you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you deal an additional 1925 flame damage over 10 seconds, and you apply a minor breach to the enemy, reducing their physical and spell resistance by 2974. So overall, it's something that you can definitely experiment with, and you can weave into some of these other solo builds. Not necessarily one that I would suggest to go with some of the other sets that we've talked about already, but you could certainly build this into a flame damage build using sets like Zons to pair with it, or other abilities that go well with dealing flame damage. In our final dungeon set to round off the solo portion of this video is the Overwhelming Surge set. We actually talked about this in the Golden Vendor not too long ago because it was there. When you deal damage with a class ability, you surround yourself in a torrent that deals shock damage to enemies within 8 meters of you. And then after that, you gain 15% of the damage you deal back into Magicka. This is kind of one of those good sets that pairs well because it deals area of effect damage, so it's good for solo farming. But more than that, it can be good to help with sustain, because that could be a problem when you're doing solo type content, especially if you're doing without companions. And Tempest Island is a base game dungeon. It's not one that I would be running to the races to talk about or bet on being one of the best in slot sets, but that's the best part of this video, is we can talk about sets that are a little bit more niche, and even though they're not necessarily overwhelmingly powerful or overwhelmingly surging. And our first PvP set is Tarnished Nightmare. You probably have heard of it, and if you haven't heard of it, if you've been in PvP, you have definitely seen it, because when you deal critical damage to an enemy, glass shards burst 8 meters around them, dealing 1129 damage to enemies in the burst radius and applying the Sundered status effect, which we'll talk about in just one moment. This can occur once every 8 seconds and scales off your weapon and spell damage, and this comes from the Scions of Athelia DLC, specifically from the Bedlam Vale dungeon. And the Sundered effect is as follows: instant damage and grants you 100 weapon and spell damage for 4 seconds. The Sundered status effect, instant damage, applies minor breach for 4 seconds, reducing the armor. Sundered can be applied by both skills that deal physical damage, weapon, and chant sets. Sundered status can be most affected by yada yada yada. So Sundered is a great effect to be able to put people under, but also importantly too, this set also deals quite a bit of critical chance. This is one of the more popular sets that's running around right now. People have been describing it as a nerf candidate. I do definitely think that that's true, but I also think that it's still going to be wildly popular just based on the Sundered status effect, as well as the other bonuses that are built into it as well. Next up, from Depths of Malatar, we have Scavenging Demise. When you deal critical poison damage to an enemy, you summon a Scavenging Maw, just like a creature-looking thing, behind them to attack your enemy after 2 seconds. This deals poison damage and importantly inflicts minor vulnerability for 15 seconds, increasing their damage taken by 5%. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds and scales off your weapon or spell damage. So this is a really cool effect. I will warn you though that this is also fairly easy to dodge. I actually really like Scavenging Demise on my PvP Nightblade builds, but I will warn you that people can dodge it. They have a 2-second window to kind of realize that they're about to be hit from behind. Now, a lot of people don't always look behind them. You know, they've not walked the lame streets at night, so they don't know that there is a red AoE forming behind them. But a lot of experienced players will learn to dodge this effect. So I've seen significant success in this in battlegrounds where people are not as expecting it, and in Cyrodiil when you're in conflicts where there's just too much going on at a time. But if you're doing things like trying to burst on a single enemy who's paying attention, it can be very hard to get this effect to apply on them. And there's other sets that could potentially be better, but it's still a great set and definitely worth considering if you're interested in that type of content. Next up, we have another very straightforward one. When you deal damage with the flame ability, you apply the burning status effect to the enemy and increase your weapon and spell damage by 490 for 8 seconds. This can occur every 12 seconds. Obviously, this is used more in the flamey PvP people. Dragon Knights love Burning Spell Weave. There are a lot of options for, especially Dragon Knights, to use for different types of pairings of sets and things. This is not necessarily the best thing for them to use, but it comes from City of Ash. It's a base game dungeon, and I have to say, I think it's still pretty decent. Next up, from Direfrost Keep, we have Draugr which is just crafty Alfiq if it was stamina. You don't really need to say a whole lot about this, but stamina also has a really nice reason to make it high, because you can deal more damage by having higher max stamina. You also can use it for things such as blocking and roll dodging. So overall, I think this is a perfectly serviceable set. It gives you stamina, and it's relatively straightforward. You get it from Direfrost Keep, a base game dungeon. Next up is a set that you guys were hyping up in the chat, but I don't have a whole lot of personal experience with, and that is from Castlethorn, from the Stonethorn DLC. When you deal damage with a blink, charge, leap, teleport, or pull, You cut your enemy, causing them to bleed, dealing 1870 bleed damage over time and applying the hemorrhage status effect every tick. This can occur every 10 seconds, and it's going to go off your weapon and spell damage. I think that this is perfectly serviceable. We've seen tons of classes: blink, charge, pull, leap, teleport. Basically every class can do that, especially because of the mist form changes and all the other class tools that you have available at your disposal. I've personally not used this before, but if something like this would interest you, this is certainly a set that you could use. I also think of things such as werewolf builds. This comes to mind, unfortunately. It comes to mind, unfortunately, because I'm not a werewolf enjoyer, but you could definitely see why this would be something that they might go for. Next up, we have Sheer Venom from the Imperial City Prison. When you deal damage with an execute ability, you infect that enemy, dealing some poison damage over 6 seconds, and you deal up to 100% more damage to enemies under 100% of their health. So lower health, more damage, and this can occur once every 6 seconds. The reason why I think Sheer Venom is so popular right now is because of the RIP Calorians, which used to be really the go-to for a lot of Nightblades. Now I feel like there's a lot more experimentation going on with PvP, and a lot of these sets like Sheer Venom have maintained decent relevancy throughout the years that they've been out. I would say that they've never really quite been S tier, but sometimes you just need a solid B to A tier set to slap on one of your PvP builds, and you just go out there and you can start whacking people. Next up, we have Grave Inevitability from Graven Deep. Now, this is definitely a small group style PvP set, and this is also used as a support set for other classes. So sometimes healers, tanks, other people may be running this just to try to build stacks for their team, depending on if it's different types of content. Because when you deal damage with a lighter or heavy attacks, it grants you a stack of Remorsefulness for 5 seconds, and after 5 stacks, you generate an aura granting you major force, increasing your critical damage by 20%, and all group members within 12 meters of you, minor force, increasing their critical damage by 10%. You'll see this in PvP ball groups, but it's also just a good overall support set that you might see like a healer, for example, running. So we're just kind of grouping those thoughts together into this just blurb that we don't have to talk about it twice, but it comes from Graven Deep, Grave Inevitability, Graven Deep. Move on. Next up, we have Draugr Grip, which is definitely not one of the more popularly used sets in the game, but you can see what it does. It's relatively straightforward. From Unhallowed Grave, increases your damage done by 330, but reduces your healing received by 10%, but you also get a line of Magicka, Penetration, and Mag Recovery. A lot of sets don't build in Penetration, so this could be really good. That way you can use different traits, or you can use other set bonuses to not have to get Penetration from other types of areas. But overall, this is definitely the more niche sets that we're talking about, but I still wanted to highlight it because you guys brought it up when we were talking about PvP dungeon sets. Next up, we have from the Imperial City Prison, Leeching Plate. When you take damage, you summon a cloud of leeching poison under the assailant. The cloud deals 427 poison damage every 1 second for 5 seconds and heals you 100% for the damage caused. This is a bit of a very unique set. I've seen off-tanks use this in situations where they're just trying to not die. I've seen people use this in PvP, especially those big overground fights, just because there's so many people in such a small area. But overall, this is, again, one of the more niche sets that we're talking about, but it's still one that says, hey, decent one to maybe consider. Next up, we have the Ice Furnace set, which is really just being highlighted because Mag Wardens are becoming good again, and Wardens in general are finally seeing the uptick they deserve. But when you deal frost damage, you deal an additional 238 flame damage to all enemies within 8 meters around the initial target. This effect can occur once every second and scales off your weapon or spell damage, and this is from Dire Frost Keep. It's very easy dungeon to farm, and overall could be really good if you're looking to make a nice little warden. Next up, we have Spriggan's Vigor. When you deal critical damage, you restore 100 stamina and gain a stack of wild growth for 5 seconds, increasing your max stamina by 222. This can occur and stack up to 10 times. It can occur once every half second. This comes from Shipwright's Regret. It's a good PvP sustain set that also increases your max stamina pool, which can be very helpful because your max stamina pool can also determine a lot of other things, such as a little bit of damage was also woven into your max amount of stamina. So overall, good set combination, good for sustaining, especially if you don't need to really worry about Magicka sustain. This is a really good alternative. And people sometimes do use this for tanking if they're trying to build in a little bit of extra sustain for themselves too. definitely a more niche utilization for it. You don't really see PvE tanks using this a lot, but it is one that can help with sustain issues. And to wrap off the PvP section, we have Calorians, which comes from Fanglair. This is now a free DLC because everyone's getting it for logging in for the month of September. When you deal critical damage with a light or heavy attack, you launch a projectile at your target that deals 894 flame, frost, shock, or disease damage and applies the respective status effect. This can occur once every 5 seconds. This has been nerfed, unfortunately. It's still very decent, though, especially if you're trying to build a Nightblade and you don't have access to all the DLCs. This is still perfectly serviceable. It's just on an S tier set, which realistically is what it used to be. This is probably more in the B plus tier range. And to start the controversial portion of this video, we have Pillar of Nirn. Now, I also want to start by noting, Pillar of Nirn is no longer the best in slot, easy parse, crazy DPS output that it used to be. It is still fantastic, and it is still the perfect stepping stone to go to realistically, which you're going to go to next, which is either Reliquin or Perfected Reliquin. So this is the perfect stepping stone DPS set for you to get from Falkreath Hold, because when you deal damage, you create a fissure underneath the enemy for 1 second, dealing bleed damage to all enemies within 2.5 meters, causing them to bleed for an additional 2405 bleed damage over 10 seconds. This can occur once every 10 seconds and scales off your weapon and spell damage. This is just a great still DPS PvE set that does good damage output, and you can still easily parse over 100,000, but it's probably capped to about 110,000, even if you were to get your parsing perfect. Next up, we have Kinroz, which I will admit I was thinking about axing from this video just because I think Kinroz is a bit outdated these days. But let's talk about it anyway. It comes from Black Drake Villa. When you deal damage with a light or heavy attack, you grant a stack of Burning Heart for 5 seconds, up to 5 stacks. Once you have that, it grants you Major Berserk, increasing your damage done by 10%. And while you have an Aura of Wrath, group members within 12 meter range of you grant Minor Berserk. The biggest problem Kinroz have is that sometimes these buffs can become redundant. You may or may not need to utilize and have Major or Minor Berserk because your group members may be getting it from somewhere else. And that is the goofiest part, unfortunately, of sometimes why set combinations can be tricky, is that if you're already getting Major or Minor Berserk from places, the set is not going to be as good. But if they're not, then the set could be really good. So that's just something to keep in mind. Kinroz definitely has been outclassed by a lot of people getting those buffs from other places, but it still remains a good DPS set. It's definitely not as good, though, as it used to be. Another one that sometimes falls into this is Zogden's Warband. From Frostbolt, when you do critical damage, you gain a stack of Precision, increasing your critical chance by 177 for 5 seconds, up to 10 stacks max. At max stat, you also gain Minor Force, which increases your critical chance damage done by 10%. So Minor Force, critical damage done by 10%. Couple problems. You may already have Minor Force from somewhere else, and if so, that could be pretty annoying and kind of redundant. The other thing too is that you don't usually need that much critical chance because you're already weaving in and getting a lot of critical chance bonus, either from potions, either from other players. So you generally don't need to build as much of that into your 5-piece. You don't see a whole lot of Mother Sorrow being recommended anymore, because people have mathematically figured out that it's not as essential as it used to be. So overall, I think that this is a perfectly serviceable set. It's certainly not the best that it used to be, but it is still good enough, importantly, to get you to the point where you are going to get those best in slot sets. Because as we said earlier, you can get the other best in slot trial sets once you start getting to your dungeon sets that you can deal enough damage on. You're going to be able to get your Whirls, your Riptides, your Reliquins. Zogden's Warband is going to be perfectly serviceable in getting to a point where you can get either the perfected or non-perfected versions of those pieces of gear. And that's really what's essential about the stepping stone for PvE DPS gear. Because realistically, the number one PvE sets are always going to be pretty much trial sets, because that's supposed to be the creme de la creme. But these are the sets that are going to get you there. And it's going to get you there based on the DLCs and the content that you own. Going to get you to parse high enough to get you into those trials, get you ready to deal all the damage that you need to do to complete them. However, a set that does stack up to most trial sets is Azure Blight. When you deal damage with a damage over time effect, you apply a stack of Blight Seed to your target for 5 seconds. At 20 stacks, the seed explodes, dealing disease damage to the target and nearby enemies, plus an additional 30% per enemy hit, up to 180%, scaling off your weapon and spell damage. You can only trigger one explosion every half seconds. An enemy can only have one instance of Blight Seed at a time. This is a great DPS set. Like, this is one of the ones that I think everybody should own if they're interested in one of the more best in slot type, especially if you're doing dot damage. This is going to be your go-to, in my opinion. Next up, we have Zens, which almost really should be classified as a support class, but let's talk about it. Your light attacks apply the Zen's touch on an enemy for 20 seconds. Enemies with the touch of Zen take an additional 1% more damage for each damage over time effect you've placed on them, up to 5%. You can only receive the benefit of one touch of Zens per enemy. Why is this essential? Because it's its own buff. So, or debuff, depending on how you look at it. If you're the enemy, it's a debuff. If you're doing it, it's kind of a buff to you. But 5% is nothing to scoff at. The problem is that this only works for one time. So it does not help you to have two Zens people in a trial. You only need one. So it's almost like a support class. It comes from Lair of Marsalok. It's one of these sets that I think people should also own. But in a trial group where you're running, 8-ish DPS, depending on what you're doing, you only need one Zens, and it's usually a Dragon Knight, so just keep that in mind. This is an S tier set. This is incredible. It gives you access to a buff that can only be accessed by this set, but unfortunately, it doesn't stack, and you can't wear it multiple times to get additional bonuses. But if you were like, Jake, I want to be a good DPS Dragon Knight boy, well, this is a great option for you and other people who also have access to this ability. When you deal damage over times, you deal 209 additional flame damage every third tick. This scales off your weapon and spell damage. So if you're thinking to yourself, I want to be a Dragon Knight or another dot build, this is great. It comes from Scrivener's Hall. It does have the ability to do some of that S tier damage that comes out. It's from Scrivener's Hall. It's one of the newer sets. That does mean it's potentially a nerf candidate, but it has been out now for a little bit and hasn't seen too much tweaking to where it's become not good. This still remains in probably the top 10 best DPS sets in the game, including all of those trial sets. So, a great option, especially if you don't want to be a Zen's DK. Now, if you were thinking to yourself, Jake, I do want to be the Zen's DK, but there's already one of those. Well, you could be the Elemental Catalyst boy, because similar concept, when you deal Flame Shock or Frost damage, you apply a stack of Flame Shock or Frost weakness to the enemy for 3 seconds. Each stack of Elemental weakness increases their critical damage taken by 5%. An enemy can only have one stack of each elemental weakness at a time, so it can have Frost, Shock, or Flame at a time. However, you're going to only be the one that's able to do that because it only stacks one time. So you only need one Elemental Catalysty boy, but it is still a best in slot set to use. You just only never need one of them. And this almost feels like an honorable mention, but there's also the Medusa set, which gives you just straight up critical chance and then minor force, increasing your critical damage down by 10%. It comes from Arx Corneum, a base game area. This is perfectly fine if you want to do things such as solo content where you're not getting minor force from any other area, but overall it's been outclassed as this was a base game. And just super quickly, if all of those sets seem good to you, the easy option that you can pair pretty much all of them with is a set like Order's Wrath, which basically is just going to give you additional critical chance and increase your critical damage done, as well as your critical healing. It's a crafted set. It's super easy to pair with them, and then you can take all those DPS sets that we just looked at and stack them right into a little trial group for yourself. And then you can start getting the non-perfected versions of trial gear and be ready to rip and tear. And now for our healing sets, which you could also kind of include as just general support sets. When you overheal yourself or an ally, you give your target Major Courage for 5 seconds. Which increases their weapon and spell damage by 430. So, White Gold Tower, Spell Power Cure, overall a great set for you to be able to consider, but it's one that is going to be very specific in its utilization based on the type of content that you're doing, which is how most of these support sets are going to look for you. Another support set is Hollow Fang's Thirst from Moongrave Fane. When you critical heal or critical damage a target, you spawn a ball of hemoglobin at their location. After 2 seconds, the ball explodes, restoring some magicka, applying minor vitality to you and your group members within 6 meters of the ball for 9 seconds, increasing their healing received and damage shield strength by 6 seconds. Again, it's like any support class that we're going to talk about. It's got its utilizations, but overall, support sets are always going to be changed based on the type of content that you're doing, how many people, what sets you have, etc., etc. Next up, we have Jorvold's Guidance. It is actually from the funnest dungeon to run with a pug group, Scale Collar Peak. While in combat, increase the duration of all major buffs, minor buffs, and damage shields you apply to yourself and allies by 40%. You can see how this would be another really useful support set to consider. Next up, we have the Worm's Arraignment. Grants 145 magical recovery to you and up to 11 other group members within 28 meters of you. This bonus persists through death. I don't know why they needed to make it persist through death, except I guess thematically, worms, death, etc., etc. It's from the Vaults of Madness, which makes sense somehow. So this is one of those sets that people will use if there's very specific circumstances, or if the tank is struggling with needing extra recoveries, or people in the group need recoveries for whatever reason. It's one of the more niche support sets, but one that I still wanted to highlight. Next up, from the Dread Cellar, we have Scorion's Feast. He is feasting. When you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you gain an imbued aura for 10 seconds, granting you and up to 3 other group members for 307 magicka and stamina recovery. This can occur once every 20 seconds. If you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack with an imbued aura, consume it and gain an overflow for 10 seconds, granting you and those 3 other group members 307 weapon and spell damage. Notably, that's an unnamed buff, meaning that stacks with every other buff in the game. Why it could be a good support set for you to use. However, you notice though, 3 other group members. That means it's just you and your 3 friends. So that's where this can become and hit its limitations. This is definitely more of a 4-man content type support build, but still one that gives you an unnamed buff, some health or some recoveries if you would ever need those, but more importantly, that unnamed weapon and spell damage buff. And to wrap up our support one, we have Draugr's Rest. When you complete a fully charged heavy attack, you create a circle of concentrated ground that heals you and your group members within 5 meters for 50 health over 10 seconds. This can occur once every 10 seconds and scales off your higher max magicka or stamina. Comes from the Falkreath Hold. Not too shabby. And to start off our tanking portion, I will also note that tanking is definitely one of the roles that benefits the most, probably behind DPS, from having access to trial sets, unfortunately. But Crimson Oath is where we start from the Dread Cellar. While you're in combat, casting an ability, drinking a potion, or using a poison that applies a major or minor buff to yourself or an ally sends out a wave of energy that reduces the armor of nearby enemies within 12 meters by 3541 for 15 seconds. This can occur once every 12 seconds and will only occur if an enemy is within range. So, a couple of reasons why that's nice. You can actually drink potions, regain whatever out of combat, and then it won't proc. But more importantly, this is an unnamed debuff on your enemies, which we've talked about being really good, so you can see why this would be something that's very helpful, and it could definitely be great at getting rid of trash waves and getting rid of things that you just don't want to be near you, and you could weaken everything around you. Next up, we have Turning Tide from Shipwright's Regret. Thematic. When you block, you gain a flowing water for 10 seconds, causing your next bash attack damage to deal 22-23 magic damage, but importantly, it also applies major vulnerability for 10 seconds, increasing your damage taken by 10%, and this effect can occur once every 15 seconds, and the damage will scale off your max health. You can see why this would be helpful. Now you're applying a major debuff to an enemy, which just helps things die quicker, which is important if you're a tank, because you actually don't have to tank if everything is dead. In a similar vein, you have Drake's Rush, which comes from Black Drake Villa. When you bash an enemy, you and up to 3 group members within 15 meters of you gain major heroism for 12 seconds, granting you 3 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. This can occur every 18 seconds. Ultimates deal a lot of damage usually and are fairly important, so being able to give your group members the ability to ult faster can be helpful for certain types of content. And that's where we wrap up, everybody. What dungeon sets do you think are missing? We spent an hour on stream plus crafting this set for you guys. We're going to continue to update this Google form in addition to writing notes in between each one. And hopefully as new dungeon sets, we'll continue to add to this list as well. But everyone, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, because tomorrow we will also be streaming from 5:30 to 6:30, talking about the best monster sets for everybody to own, including their 1-piece and 2-piece potential, depending on the type of content that we're doing. We're trying to get all this content out before we have our Undaunted Celebration event, and we're also starting to include other sets such as crafted sets, monster sets, trial sets, etc., trying to highlight ones that are good, but also giving honorable mentions to ones that have still maintained decency throughout the time period, because, as always, not everybody has access to every DLC, so them having access to a good set that can easily get them a parse of 75,000 or higher is still worth it in my book. So thank you guys one last time, and as always, we're doing our 3 giveaway drawings. All you have to do to enter is leave a comment in the comments below. Second thing is just be subscribed / follow on Twitch and Twitter for 2 additional entries. And the third thing is look for a hidden word to be flashed upon the screen. I will tell you that the hidden word for last month was never seen. So if you want to try to go find it, feel free. I guess if it's not found for a while, I'll start giving more clues as to which video it was on and close to the timestamp. I think I hit it a little too well. So thank you guys so much again, and I'll catch you later. Bye, guys.
You better remember to like and subscribe to Jakeclips. Or you should. I might have to pluck your eyes if you don't. Or, better yet, I'll skip rope with your entrails. Do it now. Subscribe. Ta-ta. Off with you.